This is Radio Ecoshock with Alex Smith.
Burning fossil fuels almost ended all life on Earth. Science journalist Peter Brannon took Atlantic magazine readers back to the planet's worst mass extinction. Will the deep past emerge again in the future? Professor David Archer has studied and published books and many scientific papers on the deep past. In a new look, he joins into the deep future. I'm Alex Smith. You're about to get together with our wide-ranging conversation broadcast February 2021 on Radio Ecoshock. Let's get to your work. In a paper published in July 2020, you examine the ultimate cost of carbon. It's really hard to imagine how humans might live hundreds of years from now, but what did you find out about the real cost of free dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere?
Hundreds of thousands of years, Alex, not just hundreds of years. That's how long the CO2 that we release today will impact the climate in the future. And that was what I was going for, was trying to bridge the gap between those sort of geologic timescales in the future and the kind of human timescales that economic analysis kind of encompasses.
Well, there is a dark assumption in the paper about the deep future, and I'd just like to quote this slightly complicated sentence. You say that you estimate climate impacts as fractional decreases in economic activity, potentially amplified by a human population response to a diminished human carrying capacity. Should we assume there will be a diminished human carrying capacity for people on this planet?
Well, it's pretty much impossible to forecast the deep future with any reliability. You read what people predicted 100 years ago for now, and where are the flying cars? So I didn't really want to go there. So we treated humanity the way you would some other biological system, without the possibility of technological advancement, just because that's what we are able to do. We have to sort of isolate the climate change impact as it would affect sort of, agriculture and human habitability kind of as it has been. But, what the future holds is totally beyond the scope of anything I could think about or get anybody else to help me think about. So we kind of, penciled humanity as a technological society out of the equation, and we're just talking about the people as if we were a simple biological system. If you have more room for a certain type of organism, you'll have more of that organism, more mosquitoes in a warmer world, for example. That's kind of how we had to approach it.
But why try to calculate what it will cost people long into the future?
It's hard to think about deep time for people who aren't sort of trained geologists who have acclimated to thinking about it, especially to think about it in the future. So the paper was sort of an attempt to change the units. So the global warming timescale is to the economic timescale as, the ultimate cost of carbon of hundreds of thousands of dollars per ton is to the immediate cost of carbon to us of $50 a ton or something like that they come up with. So it's just kind of a trying to change the units into something that people can get their heads around more easily. It's just making a point.
I guess if there's going to be increased storms, droughts, heat, and all that, it's going to keep costing people, as long as there are people, for a very, very long time. And that seems to be one of the major points of your exercise there in the paper.
Well, one thing that isn't obvious from the public discussion of climate change is that the sea level rise doesn't stop in the year 2100, which is pretty much when most of our, projections kind of stop. Ultimately, the ice sheets take thousands of years to respond, hopefully not less than that. And at that time, the sea level rise that we provoke now could be, 50 meters or something like that. And a lot of our agricultural land is low-lying land in river deltas that are very fertile. So yeah, it's a significant downgrade.
And some of your other work reminds me of Alan Weissman and his book, The World Without Us. Weissman found the secret behind all our structures is maintenance. And if maintenance stops, skyscrapers fall, bridges go down, many signs of human's existence disappear within a few hundred years. But you scanned the deep future landscape and you found Mercury. Tell us about that.
Oh, this is another thing that I was working on, was a model of how Mercury cycles in the ocean. And it wasn't my discovery in that paper. It was a researcher named Helen Amos, whom I've never met, but she's written these fantastic papers about the Mercury cycle on Earth, which it gets released to the atmosphere in from coal combustion and small scale gold mining and things like that. And it actually exists as a gas in the atmosphere for something like a year, which means that it can travel all around the world before it deposits. So it's a global issue, which makes it much harder to solve politically than when things are more local. But then after it deposits, after it comes back down to the ground, either in the atmosphere, to the land surface or the ocean, it tends to recycle again back to the atmosphere. So the whole biosphere, including the organic carbon pools on land and the deep ocean, is like a giant mercury flywheel that we're charging up with mercury, and it will continue to poison the seafood and, you know, affect ecosystems and people for something like 8,000 years is what the estimate is, which is astonishing to me, that we could, you know, cause a degradation to the planet that can't even in theory be fixed. We could in theory clean up the CO2 in the atmosphere, because half of the CO2 we ever emitted is still in the air. So if we could filter some fraction of the air, we could, you know, clean it up. But only a tiny fraction of the mercury that we have released is in the atmosphere, a few percent maybe. And a lot of the mercury that's raining down on us to now is what's called legacy anthropogenic. It's stuff that was released back in the gold rush and times like that, which, you know, has gone to ground and recycled again. So it's just this immense mercury flywheel that we're getting going.
Well, when I was studying pulp mill damages, there was a pulp mill in Minamata, Japan, which was using mercury as a slimicide on its logs, and that got out into the bay and into the seafood of the people there, and they had all sorts of birth defects, and this can pass on through a couple of generations. It's terribly toxic stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, it's like kryptonite for us. It just unhinges us in lots of different ways.
So is there a technical fix where we can just clean the mercury back out and go back to previous life?
Not even optimistically, no. No, it's out there, it's just going. You can't, you know, dig up all the organic carbon in the soils and treat it. It's gone to ground. And the deep ocean, you know, can't clean that.
Well, speaking of technical fixes, I was a bit alarmed when you recommended two books, both of them about geoengineering our way out of the climate crisis. We have Elizabeth Colbert's new book, How to Cool the Planet, Geoengineering and the Audacious Quest to Fix Earth's Climate, and then Oliver Morton with The Planet Remade. My first reaction is, are we already at that last resort point? Are we that desperate now?
Well, it's not a way out of the climate problem. If anything, it's sort of a temporary Band-Aid. I mean, we don't want to leave the climate on life support for future generations, so that if they, you know, if something broke down and they didn't keep putting, you know, sulfur in the stratosphere, suddenly they would get clobbered with all the climate change all at once. That's not, you know, a fix exactly for the climate change. But I thought the Oliver Morton book made a good case for how it could happen, about, say, some country that got its carbon footprint act together. New Zealand came to mind when I was reading it. Logistically, it's not that hard for someone to shoot sulfur up into the stratosphere and engineer the climate. The only way we would know that some country was doing that was by tracking who was buying lots of sulfur that they don't need for anything else. You couldn't measure that this was happening really from a satellite, I don't think. So then this country might say, okay, we're, announce that they're doing this, and then allow any other country that also gets their carbon footprint together to help in making the decision about, how much to dial the thermostat back, which is a very tricky question on a global planet with all different climates like ours. He argues that we've already hacked the biosphere. The nitrogen cycle is totally whacked out by the Haber-Bosch process of making fertilizers, and there are other examples, I'm sure, of ways in which the world is totally not natural anymore. Remember Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature? That was kind of heartbreaking.
It was, and it turned a lot of people towards, I think, thinking better about the environment. In other papers, you consider an alternative past. What would have happened if atmospheric carbon dioxide was lower when the coal revolution got rolling in the mid to late 1700s?
Well, this is interesting. I sort of draw the analogy to the first nuclear bomb tests, where there was an outside possibility that the bomb could set the atmosphere on fire, basically, and end all life on Earth. And so they thought about it, and they came up with what the critical, reaction cross sections are, or whatever the parameter, and they decided, well, it's not going to happen, so let's just go ahead and do it. When we started burning coal, it was kind of like that. Only the critical parameter for what was going to happen is the amount of CO2 that was in the air at that time, which is important because the change in the climate depends on the ratio, how much the CO2 changes, how many doublings of CO2 you exert. And so if you start from more CO2 in the natural atmosphere, the CO2 you add doesn't lead to as many doublings as if the amount that you had originally was lower. And the amount that was there in the natural world was set by this amazing CO2 thermostat mechanism that on long timescales, too long to help us out of our personal mess, unfortunately, but over geologic time, the CO2 finds the level where it balances the carbon cycle, CO2 coming out of the Earth in degassing volcanoes and hot springs and things, versus the weathering reactions that dissolve calcium and grab the CO2 and make it into calcium carbonate that goes to the seafloor, which is how the carbon goes back into the Earth. So if the settings of that thermostat had been much different, if the sun had been warmer, for example, or if the Earth had been just a few percent closer to the sun, or if, intelligent life had happened a billion years later when the sun was naturally hotter or something, the CO2 could have been lower when we discovered coal, in which case what happens is the trajectory of the climate change just gets shifted earlier in time. So the fact that there was CO2 in the air when we discovered coal kind of masked the climate changes that resulted from that for, until this day. So if the CO2 had been like 10 times lower than it turned out to be, which it could easily have been, and nobody at that time knew what it was or the significance of that number, the climate changes that we're seeing now would have happened around 1900 or something like that, when Svante Arrhenius was kind of making an educated guess about how much CO2 might change the climate, but there was no way to know for sure, and the data was terrible, and we have much more options today to change our energy usages and things like that. So it really helped us out. It gave us a break that there was so much CO2 already in the air. It's like a long fuse. You light a long fuse and it takes a while before the bomb goes off. So it was, kind of one of the reviewers called it something like exo-sociology or something like that, which seemed to me I should get an institute about that. That's kind of, I think that reviewer was not being positive, but I kind of thought that was pretty funny.
Well, right, people say, well, we can't think about what's going to happen to humanity 2,000 years ago, but the Romans did. They built roads that are still in use in Europe today, 2,000 years later. What would have happened if the Romans had discovered coal and technology, and, well, where would we be now?
We'd be angry at the Romans, I believe. If say if hurricanes didn't exist before they did that thing, and so every hurricane that hit, we could blame them. How would we feel about that? I wouldn't want to be a Roman in that case. I don't want to leave that legacy personally.
You're listening to Ecoshock Radio for the world.
I'm Alex Smith. Get it all at our website, ecoshock.org.
You are tuned to Radio Ecoshock. We are talking with David Archer from the University of Chicago. David, do you still help moderate the Real Science blog, and how is that going?
Real Climate? No, Real Climate has kind of collapsed. Just speaking for myself, I don't know, I've lost a lot of my vim and vigor about, public outreach. I in the last 4 years, have been kind of crushing, and I've sort of felt like, we as a society no longer have enough, objective reality in common to even make it worth talking. I just, I feel like I've said what there is to say, and I'm not out there fighting the Great War anymore. I stopped flying for carbon footprint reasons maybe 5-6 years ago, and my wife keeps telling me if I'm going to do that and inconvenience everybody in my life, I should at least write some sort of manifesto explaining why I'm doing it, and I just don't even have the drive to do that.
It's so interesting you say this, because a number of climate communicators have stepped back from the public arena. Robert Scribbler stopped his influential climate blog. Professor Peter Ward was advising TV documentaries, published 3 books. Now he's pretty quiet. Maybe the science is all in and there's not much left to say.
Well, it does seem like the only evolution in the science is that things seem to happen faster than we had expected them to, like ice streams and glaciers in the West Antarctic ice sheet, and sea ice in the North Atlantic, and things like that. Things are only sort of getting kind of worse, but they're not fundamentally changing. And it almost seems like there's less pushback on the other side too. The sort of, you don't, correct me if you have seen differently, but it seems like there is less papers that are like deliberate attempts to deceive and say that climate, doesn't change for whatever reason. It's like the whole debate has just gone into the background with more immediate concerns of not getting sick and whatnot.
I think there is less active climate denialism. Some of the big corporations that were funding it and doing it directly are a little more embarrassed. But I think that the Russians are still at it, and there's still fossil fuel lobbyists doing what they do. Now, it seems to me humans always want to know how our survival drama turns out. There's just like an almost cult-like yearning to get into this climate emergency right now, full bore, and get it over with. And, maybe like the methane bomb crowd, they expect a final act. But really, from my reading of your work in climate change, it seems like we should more expect death by 1,000 cuts.
Yeah, I don't know what to say, I guess. Yeah. I sort of view it as a waste management problem. One way to frame it is that back in Victorian London, everybody used to just poop in chamber pots and throw it in the streets, I guess. And It just became unworkable, and so they built like a river or something to carry the sewage, so that it would at least go into the river downstream of the city, something like that, a rudimentary, sewage processing thing. And it was probably controversial in its day, because probably only the poor people got sick, and so the rich people didn't want to pay for it. But looking back on it now, it was just not an option to keep pooping in the streets. And I think that's totally the way it is with putting our CO2 in the atmosphere. It's just not a workable thing. But we haven't come to grips with that yet.
A few years ago, I interviewed the Canadian climate scientist Andrew Weaver, and he removed himself from science for a while, and he successfully ran as a Green Party candidate for the legislature in my home province here in British Columbia. I wonder, is it time for more scientists to get political and to get the changes that we all know we need?
Maybe, but it's not going to come from me. I could never win. I'm not a leader of people. I don't. I don't seem to do. I'm not very good at that. I think it takes a certain type to go. Inspire people to do things that they wouldn't have done. And maybe it's time for Greta Thunbergs of the world to do that. I mean, the science is in. You don't need old guys to tell you about the science. You need young people to say, "This is my planet that you're trashing."
Well, putting our cards on the table, do you think that humans will react in time to save ourselves from a hard period of heat, drought, storms, and all that stuff?
Well, I guess my best hope is that eventually we will start cleaning CO2 out of the atmosphere, because that's the only way to fix this. And one of the really startling things about that possibility is how incredibly expensive it would be, given the costs that you can read about from David Keith, for example, who's talking about direct air capture. But Bill McKibben sort of set up the goalposts that a safe level of CO2 is about 350. That's the level that would negate the energy imbalance at the top of the atmosphere. So it would mean that a planet wouldn't get any warmer than that. And, just to get to that, just to get the CO2 back down to 350 would be a massive, massive task. But, if we decided to do it, we could do it. I could imagine sort of big companies like analogous to defense contractors or something that, once they get a gravy train, they get, paid to scrub CO2 out of the atmosphere enough where they have their own lobbyists, then we're good. It's just getting to that point.
Do you think that this COVID-19 will or is skewing our relationship to the climate threat?
It'll be interesting to see. One of the ways that we burn carbon is traveling around a lot. And I was sort of declining invitations to go speak at places and offering to do it by video, long before COVID started. And rarely did anybody take me up on that. They always wanted a real physical body. And maybe we've gotten used to talking on, remotely now. So, that could be a thing. In terms of the CO2 in the atmosphere, I've read a couple papers about whether you can detect COVID in the trajectory of CO2 in the atmosphere. And really, you basically can't, because a lot of the carbon emissions is still going on. And, it's an accumulating pollutant. So, it's like watching the odometer on a bicycle. If you stop pedaling or slow down a little bit pedaling for a little while, it doesn't really change the odometer reading all that much in a year or something like that, or a short time.
But I do worry about science in the big picture, because like an Antarctic expedition was canceled, the COP meeting, the big climate meeting was canceled, and some science conferences aren't happening, so scientists aren't getting those times over a beer and a hot dog to talk about these things. And also we have a public who apparently is more willing to believe anything rather than the facts. We've got all this conspiracy theory things going. So I worry about the position of science in society now.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're still sort of, I was going to say a science-based society, but it's not even really necessarily, yeah, I worry too. If we don't have, objective reality in common that we all acknowledge, then what do we have?
Well, I hope you won't be insulted when I say this, but I still picture you as the kind of kid who would find something interesting and dig and scurry right after it until you find it. And you've done that several times in your career. Where are you going now? What are you working on these days?
I am thinking, I'm working on trying to do a model of the chemistry of the Earth, kind of like the Burner model that predicted the silicate thermostat that, changes through time. But that model it had no, it didn't have maps in it. It was just the only dimension in it was time. So you had some parameter that you would turn when mountains come up that you say impacts the weathering or something like that. But my goal is to sort of expand that into a framework that includes the plates moving around and deposition of sediments that happens when you have uplift over here and then the stuff gets transported over there and sort of deposits. And so it seems like, there are detailed models of the atmosphere, that show individual storms and oceans that show the geography of where the basins are and things like that. But in terms of this large-scale geochemical carbon cycle, there are no models that incorporate, maps. And if you want to compare the results of such a model with, real geological data, a lot of that data is sort of the thickness of these sedimentary layers and their chemistry and whatnot. So it's trying to investigate phenomenon like the uplift of the Himalayas, responsible maybe for the fact that we're in an ice age today, and other sorts of things like that in the deep past.
I just read a paper about that, which put forward the idea that we had about 1 billion years of very quiet activity, no mountain building on Earth. And during that time, there was very little evolution either. So it seems like you need mountains in order to have evolutionary changes.
Could be. I'm going to get together with some colleagues and discuss a recent review paper about the snowball Earths, which also seem to be implicated somehow in, first off, not quite extinguishing the eukaryotic life that, turned into multicellular animals and whatnot, but also the multicellular stuff kind of popped into being right after the snowballs ended and oxygen went up. And so it definitely seems like some kind of a birth trauma of the biosphere.
It's kind of ironic that we're recovering the memory of what Earth has been just at the very time when we seem likely to destroy a lot of the things that generate that knowledge if we're not very, very careful. I don't know where you fit on the optimism-pessimism scale. Where do you?
It varies wildly from, day to day. If you're factoring into optimism, pessimism, what I think humanity will do. But I agree that the paleoclimate reconstructions are really powerful motivation for concern about the future. The Holocene has been something like 10,000 years of extremely stable flat climate, and before that was the deglaciation and all these abrupt climate changes where the climate in the North Atlantic and around the world would change just in a few years because of flip-flops of ocean circulation and sea ice and things like that. So the whole climate change discussion seems like it would be sort of sterile without the perspective of the past. 5 years ago, I sort of had the feeling that bringing up the end Permian extinction and other disasters like that was a bit over the top in terms of, climate change. But reading Brannon's book about the extinctions, or the papers that are behind it, a lot of them had to do with CO2 from volcanoes, big, large igneous provinces, huge amounts of CO2 coming out, causing changes in biology. So there's a lot of parallels, which makes it really sobering.
We have just spent time with Professor David Archer, author and American scientist at the University of Chicago. Find links to David and the science we talked about in my weekly show blog at ecoshock.org. Thank you, David. It's always stimulating talking with you.
It certainly is, Alex. Thank you so much.
I'm Alex Smith for Radio Ecoshock.